Hey there folks, the not #1 Architects fan from the Infinite Jukebox here with another album review, and today I wanted to talk about the new Architects record, The Sky, the Earth, and All Between. They are on a run of god-awful album titles as of late. Architects have seemingly gone from a fairly well-liked, or at least seemingly well-liked metalcore band to a significantly more polarizing beast, shall we say. And obviously there's a lot of controversy that I could get into that would more accurately depict why they are not necessarily as popular with metalheads today as they were just maybe 10 years ago, or even 5 years ago. But at the same time, from a musical standpoint, it's also not hard to see why a lot of people haven't really given them a chance in recent years. But with a lot of that backlash being focused on the sort of electronic influences and alt-rock influences that the band have been embracing over the course of their past couple records, especially with their 2022 record, The Classic Symptoms of a Broken Spirit, one of the corniest album titles in metal in recent years, it would be easy to shrug off a lot of that criticism as just being die-hard metalcore fans not willing to follow a band into uncharted territory as they experiment. After all, it is very easy to see plenty of metalcore purists out there who will willingly ditch a band almost immediately the second that they try to do something new, try to reinvent themselves in some way. Basically, if it's metalcore or gent or any other similar subgenre that often fuses with each other in some way or another in certain corners of metal, chances are there is some type of fan of that subgenre that's going to completely up and ditch a band if they aren't constantly doing the same thing over and over. And in that sense, I think it would be pretty fair to immediately assume that Architects are actually just doing fine musically, and people just don't really understand them now. However, I think it would also be much easier to see, just by listening to The Sky, the Earth, and All Between, that this is an absolutely atrocious record that somehow manages to rival the soullessness of 2021's For Those That Wish to Exist, which is an achievement, I guess. Definitely an achievement of some sort. I just don't think it's a good one. One of the bigger weights that kind of holds down The Sky, the Earth, and All Between is none other than longtime frontman Sam Carter, who has always been a more than competent vocalist for Architects, but lately he just has not been on his A-game for the past several albums that the band has put out, if I'm being completely honest. I mean, from the start, he's always been one of the more practiced and smoothed out metal vocalists to hit the relative mainstream as metal will get in the 2010s and 2020s at the very least. And I don't think that he's a bad vocalist at all, but the increasingly higher production value and the increasingly heavier electronic influence and stadium rock kind of influences that are being introduced into Architect's sound, they just don't do anything, ironically, to really help highlight that vocal ability. I mean, here on this record, it's just one mediocre vocal performance after the next. I mean, sure, he is a technically impressive vocalist. There's no question that the man is, again, more than competent at what he does, but at the same time, it's been a long time since any of Carter's vocal performances for Architects have felt raw and unfiltered, or even really emotionally available in any sort of way, and that's definitely not a good thing when this record is trying to be more emotionally vulnerable than perhaps anything else that Architects have put out to date, with a lot of the lyrics here being, at least to varying degrees, somewhat personal, and it makes for a record that feels like it should be this very open-hearted and earnest record that just doesn't come across as anything like that, because a lot of the time, his vocals just feel so focused on technical prowess that all of the emotion that he attempts to pour out just feels disingenuous in turn, and that certainly doesn't help when, again, paired with the hugely over-polished nature of this album, and the over-the-top unnecessary anthemics that occur during the choruses, but I'll get to that later. Now, admittedly, it does feel hard not to at least appreciate the fact that there are some pretty good tender vocal performances from Carter here on a couple of tracks, like Broken Mirror, as well as the album closing cut Chandelier, the latter of which would honestly be a halfway decent song if it weren't for the fact that the drums felt overly crisp for an otherwise somewhat muddy tune, and also the fact that a lot of the guitar work tries to do this sort of spacey, atmospheric atmospheric kind of thing that just doesn't really work out in any way, doesn't feel executed in a way that is engrossing in any particular direction, but I digress. I feel like he's a very talented vocalist, but again, he's just heavily dragged down by the overproduction on this record, and that is a consistently massive issue with The Sky, the Earth, and All Between, and also the past, 3 Architects albums, including this one. Overproduction, and that really does kill this album for me. And when I say overproduction, I don't just mean that this album sounds a little too glossy, kind of glistens a little bit too much. I mean, it definitely does, I'm not denying that, but I also mean that this record just doesn't feel like it was made by real people. It feels like you put together a group of androids and told them to create the most commercially viable metalcore that could still be classified under the genre, but be accessible to sort of pop and mainstream metal radio, and I mean that in an extremely negative way. Now, whether that sort of thing is intentional or not, honestly, I think that's up for debate. I'm not going to comment on it. I'm not a member of Architects. I wasn't in the studio when they made this shit, but, at the same time, I do feel like you could make an argument that, oh, that's slightly intentional with the further embrace of electronic influences, etc., etc. I still don't think it makes for good music, at all. In fact, I think it actually causes the record to feel extremely predictable, structurally and compositionally. I mean, almost every single song here sounds the exact same for the most part. I feel like by a quarter of the way through the album, you're able to guess what direction songs are going to go in. The majority of them have these somewhat heavy and faster verses, and then these over-emotional, over-wrought, just anthem-y, stadium-level choruses that are simultaneously so melodramatic and also so comedic with how frequently they pop up to the point they have no real emotional impact after the first couple of tracks. And even the couple of songs here or there, like Brain Dead, where the band kind of tried to go in a more heavy direction, metalcore-oriented direction that feels more authentically them when you talk about their sort of mid to late 2010s era. But even then, it just feels like them making nothing memorable out of a sound that was once pretty much Architects' bread and butter. It's just kind of a shame to hear. I feel like a lot of the choruses kind of try to be overly anthemic in the way that a lot of later-day Muse tracks kind of end up being, albeit without the world's thinnest and most obnoxious political posturing. And I know that Muse isn't necessarily the greatest comparison here overall, because they technically sound nothing alike, but it's really the only way that I could describe it. Just music that's trying to reach a stadium-level audience while also still having edge. And I don't necessarily think that any music that's trying to get a bunch of people to sing along to this big climactic powerful moment is inherently bad or anything, but I do think it's bad when it just feels so slapdash and thrown at the wall like this does, and that doesn't help at all the more gent-oriented kind of moments, because not only are they pretty bland in their own right, but they also don't have anything substantial to be paired with, making tracks that would have just been very mediocre in the first place feel even worse by comparison when you're going from pure mediocrity to the most annoying saccharine choruses you've heard in your entire life from a metalcore band. Maybe not in your entire life, because there's a lot of bad metalcore out there, but my point still stands. A lot of it just does not work, because when one part is mediocre and another part is outright bad and they come together to form a single piece of music, the worst qualities of all of them are just highlighted at the same time, and it results in a record that is not only extremely tedious to get through at times, but also just wildly predictable and, again, almost outright obnoxious in how little it cares about trying to convince the listener that they aren't just putting this out to make a record that is their most commercially accessible yet, arguably. I mean, sure, you could say that they kind of still hold on to their metalcore roots, but it really does feel like it's out of complete and total obligation for their pre-existing fan base, rather than anything that they really want to do. I honestly think that I would at least respect this album a little bit more if it just fully decided to dive right into the electronic influences and the more pop kind of influences you get during the choruses, because at least then it would be earnest about what it was. This album just feels like it's clinging to what little bit of metalcore is left for the sake of hanging on to their legacy, while at the same time going in a direction that it seems like a lot of their fan base just doesn't really like, and I just find a difficult time appreciating that, I suppose. I mean, I guess there are a couple of moments here or there where it kind of feels like Architects try to break things up to create what would have been a noticeably more interesting record, stepping away from the predictability of the album to maybe have a passage or two that's actually slower than you would expect, or maybe even a little heavier than you would expect. But as a whole, it's never enough to really make this album feel particularly engaging, and it's really difficult to feel invested in this record in any way, from an emotional standpoint, from a sort of music nerd kind of compositional standpoint, when it just feels like it lacks any sort of love or real passion. It's just an extremely dull record, and honestly, in some places, quite the slog to get through. Not just because it's a long album, because it isn't at all, frankly, but it's because it just feels like it's nothing. It doesn't feel like it represents anything. It doesn't feel like a creative step forward for Architects when it sounds that they've already experimented with in the past. It doesn't feel like them honing in on pre-existing sounds when it certainly isn't that, and it's arguably one of the furthest steps they've ever taken away from their roots as a metal band. And it never feels like it's something that the band just want to do, because it never really fully embraces those new influences either, and it leaves this record not only feeling like a dull, soulless album, but also an album that no one really wanted to be a part of. Again, I'm not saying that as a statement or a fact, but you know, it's kind of what it feels like listening to it. It just feels like an album that nobody wanted and nobody wanted to make, and that does not make for an enjoyable or fun listening experience. Listen, at this point, it would have been completely unreasonable, almost comical, to expect that The Sky, the Earth, and All Between would be any sort of return to Architects' glory days in the mid to late 2010s, but at the same time, this really does feel like a new low for the band. The songs are extraordinarily clunky. A lot of the tracks here just feel overly commercialized to the most insane extent that we've arguably ever seen from Architects, or at the very least tied for those who wish to exist, which is also a god-awful record in its own right, but, you know, I digress. I just feel like this album is nothing, and I don't know how to word it in a better way than that. It's an album that just feels like it doesn't achieve anything in any particular way, and I mean, sure, this album sounds like it's definitely ready for a lot of radio airplay, you know, getting played in large venues, maybe even like larger stadium type venues, or like whatever would be considered like right below stadium, like large concert hall, I guess, so on and so forth. It's ready for those kind of settings, sure, I guess, if you are into the sound and into Architects, but as it stands in a vacuum, this is just representative of the worst and most uninteresting, most loveless kind of pop metalcore that you can possibly access at this point, and I think it's a shame that this is what heavily represents the genre to a lot of people, because in my eyes, this is sort of like the Imagine Dragons of metal, or the later day Coldplay of metal. Just really no life behind the eyes here, and I don't really see what anybody could possibly see in this. More props to you if, you know, you can get into this and it's your thing, but it's certainly not mine. I'm going to give this record 1.5 stars out of 5. With that being said, that is the end of this album review. Thanks for watching The Infinite Jukebox, and I'll see you in the next one.